Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Book Trek 2022. This is an event created by Vin at Revenant Reads, our dauntless captain, that is designed to celebrate Star Trek fiction. He invented it last year, Book Trek 2021. It was a long event then, many months. Now it's just 2 months, August and September. And once again, is designed to celebrate Star Trek fiction, split into two halves. So August is the Wrath of Book Trek, where we're reading, I won't say necessarily old favorites, but in the old Star Trek, which I think we are compelled to call the old Star Trek. The Star Trek that was either created by Gene Roddenberry or created intentionally in the continuity of Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek. So that is Star Trek the original series and all the movies that sprang from it, the animated series, Star Trek the Next Generation and all the movies that sprang from it, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Star Trek Enterprise. Then there's a yawning gap, a trench of fire. Now, the creators of New Trek, who are working today, would vehemently deny that that is true. They would say, we are making Star Trek. We are not making some new thing. But they nevertheless aren't doing that. They would deny that, but that would be a lie, and I believe a conscious lie, since they're consciously destroying the pillars of the Roddenberry Star Trek. You can't consciously destroy something without knowing that it exists, without knowing what you're doing. And the trench of fire there starts with J.J. Abrams' Star Trek movies, which are really good eye candy. They're really good popcorn viewing, and they are unbelievably dumb and just take a wrecking ball to Star Trek, but in a harmless way because they take place in an alternate reality, like the kind that Star Trek introduced to popular science fiction. So it's no big deal. It's no skin off my nose if in an alternate reality Kirk or McCoy or whatever are doing alternate reality things. I don't care. The one character from the standard Roddenberry continuity, Mr. Spock, played by Leonard Nimoy, enters into that reality and never goes home. But we're not asked to believe that the Zachary Quinto Spock is the real Spock. It's not a recasting of the canonical Spock. It's just an alternate reality. And as such, it was possible for me to really enjoy those movies and any other movies that come out in the so-called Kelvin timeline. And then New Trek came along. Alex Kurtzman and Akiva Goldsman made New Trek. That it certainly has its issues with the standard philosophical underpinnings of the Roddenberry Trek. Let's just put it that way. We'll be nice and diplomatic. We don't want to cause problems on such a hot day. And Book Trek is not designed to be a divisive event anyway. And leaving aside what that New Trek is like, we have a whole month, we have all of September to yell at you about that. Leaving that aside, August is for that first half of Trek, what we now see as that first half of Trek. August is for the old favorites, the old known Trek. My Trek, for instance, which was the original series. But I investigated all the other incarnations, and the one incarnation that I didn't like at first was The Next Generation. The first season, the first 2 seasons, first 3 seasons did not do the show much credit. They were pretty derivative of the original Star Trek and didn't really know what they wanted to do, I think. And some Next Generation fans have sort of corroborated that. Star Trek The Next Generation was a seminal, generational event in a way that the original Star Trek, I'm perfectly willing to admit, was not. Certainly not in the extent. For a long time, I heaped scorn on the idea that for millions of people out there, The Next Generation is Star Trek. It was their Star Trek. Now I see that that is true, and I see why it's true. That's due to Book Trek 2021. I went into Book Trek 2021 as a total Next Generation skeptic and came out as a Next Generation fan. I read a ton more novels. I watched the whole of the series from start to finish with an open mind and saw a lot. Embarrassing to admit for a Star Trek fan, but I saw a lot that I had missed. And there's a common thread in what I missed and why I missed it. And maybe also in why the show took so long to find its footing. And I could be wrong here, I'm no expert, but I think that common thread is subtlety. And maybe that flows from the top. Maybe that flows from the fact that Star Trek The Next Generation got a genuinely great actor to star as the captain of the Enterprise. The rest of the cast, almost all were great. A couple were not, but almost all the rest of the cast were terrific. And that casting magic held true for Deep Space Nine, especially for Voyager, and also for Star Trek Enterprise. But in Star Trek: The Next Generation, you have a great Shakespearean trained actor setting the tone of the whole thing, or at least trying to. And I think after a few seasons, that became predominant. That tone became the tone of the show, and the tone of the whole concept of The Next Generation. And that is subtlety. These characters are multifaceted. All of them are. Almost all of them are. Multifaceted. They don't fall into easy characterizations of heroism or, Mr. Spock having a split personality or McCoy always being the outraged, warm human heart of the Enterprise. They don't fall easily into Scotty saying, "Oh, my engines, I cannot give you more power." And I admit, I'm quick to point out that those easy reductions of the original Star Trek were themselves just Band-Aids on deeper complexity. There was deeper complexity to find there if you were looking for it. But that doesn't even exist as a reduction in Star Trek: The Next Generation. There isn't any way to do that. You don't know what these characters... You can't reduce them to easy slogans. The difference between Geordi LaForge as chief engineer of the Starship Enterprise and Mr. Scott as chief engineer of the Starship Enterprise, there are so many differences, there are barely any similarities, as the show directly shows us when it brings back Scotty into the Next Generation timeline and has the two engineers together. I don't know if I'm conveying this right, but it is a very tricky thing when your watchword, the theme running through your iteration of the show, is subtlety. That wasn't true for Deep Space Nine. Complexity, I would say, was Deep Space Nine. It wasn't true for Voyager, which Voyager was, if anything, a return to the plain primary color heroism of the original show. And it wasn't true for Enterprise. Poor, disliked Enterprise that got canceled when it shouldn't have been. It was getting better and better. It shouldn't have been canceled, and who knows what the thread running through it would have been. But for Star Trek: The Next Generation, I think I missed it. I'm not a particularly subtle thinker. You try being raised by a species that likes to smell its own poop and see how subtle you get when you're 28 years old. I think that's why I missed it the first time. And boy, oh boy, once you notice that, and boy, oh boy, can you see it in the last 3 seasons of the show and in the movies. Once you notice that, once you know to look for that, there is almost no greater satisfaction. Don't get me wrong. I will stand and cheer faster than anybody if a 50-year-old Jim Kirk punches a villain on the jaw at the 3rd act of the movie. No one will cheer louder than me. But once you see subtlety as a thread running through an iteration of a show, it is so satisfying. And I think that's what I see. I won't argue until September, but I would argue that a weird dystopian version of that was trying to weave its way through Star Trek Picard. Probably for the same reason, because you have the same actor. We'll get to that. We'll get to New Trek in September. Batten down the hatches for a number of Grandpa Simpson rants and raves and lectures. Then. Not so much now. But in Book Trek 2021, when I was learning that, I was learning how to appreciate this show, and that was a wonderful gift. I did a huge amount of reading. I watched the whole of the show, and I did a huge amount of reading. I lost faith in the Next Generation novels pretty quick and stopped reading them. So there was a large number of them that I haven't read, and I didn't get to all of those in 2021. So for last night's Star Trek spin of the wheel, I picked a Next Generation novel. Blind. I have a large number of these things as ebooks. I just picked one at random. I didn't know anything about it. And it's this one. It's by Carmen Carter, and it's called The Devil's Heart. With a fairly busy Next Generation cover that has all sorts of things on it going on there. And I didn't particularly like it. And I think one of the reasons why, this must be a fairly early novel, I think one of the reasons I didn't like it is because it's not particularly subtle. It doesn't play to the strengths. And maybe that's why I don't like many Next Generation novels, because subtlety is a lot to ask of a jobbing writer who's been giving their commission a week ago and is expected to deliver in just a few weeks. And what is one of those weeks, what you humans call Christmas? Doesn't matter. Deliver or you're fired. It's under such circumstances as that, as I have pointed out many times in Star Trek-related videos, It's a lot to ask the writer to even get the names right. To ask them on top of all of that, to write a subtle book, a book that plays to the subtlety of the characters involved, that's a bit much to ask. And maybe that's why so many Next Generation novels fail. Original novels, if the novels of the original series, if you want a novel like that to succeed on at least one level, a boy's own adventure level, all you have to do is primary color heroism, and you'll do it. Primary color heroism with nothing else for the Next Generation will strike anyone as unsatisfying. And this isn't that, but it's not much more than that. This is a story about a Vulcan archaeologist, part of a mission on a faraway planet, who discovers what is under, you just might as well call it what it is. It's an alien MacGuffin called the Devil's Heart. It's a piece of old technology from an ancient old civilization that can basically do anything. It has all sorts of magical powers. This book relies heavily on the much over-relied on Saw by Arthur C. Clarke, that any technology sufficiently advanced will appear as magic to people who don't understand it. I've read that Saw and seen books premised on it so many times over the last 70 years, and I always want to say, well, it would seem as magic, but you also wouldn't recognize it. No one in 4th century Akkad would recognize an isolinear chip. You wouldn't know what it was, in other words. It wouldn't just be ready for you to use. It would be interlocked with all the technology around it. The Devil's Heart is not, and this Vulcan archaeologist, who for some weird reason is not on this cover. We have that person up in the corner looks like a Vulcan boy. And we have a bunch of other characters here. We have a Klingon, a Starfleet figure who becomes important in the course of the novel. We have, of course, Captain Picard. He's holding the Devil's Heart, and his eyes are all glowing. So you have some idea of what's happening here. But I would have redesigned this cover. Of course, the Enterprise does not belong on this cover. The Devil's Heart, maybe, but that Vulcan archaeologist belongs on the cover, and she's not. Unless that figure in the upper corner is meant to be her, but I find that hard to believe. But anyway, she discovers this thing, the Devil's Heart, and needs to be evacuated from her outpost, and Jean-Luc Picard is given the assignment. Jean-Luc Picard is a character who has dabbled in many things, in many life passions. He loves to read. He has loved archaeology so much that he almost thought he would go into it as a profession. And he knows this woman's work intimately. And it's reported that she is suffering from Bendai's syndrome, which was introduced in the Star Trek The Next Generation episode that gave us Ambassador Sarek, Mark Leonard reprising his role as Ambassador Sarek, who has Bendai's syndrome, which afflicts Vulcans and makes them lose control of their emotions in violent ways that sometimes engage their telepathy, as happens in that episode. The Enterprise has sent the fig leaf of justification that Jean-Luc Picard uses is that Beverly Crusher diagnosed Sarek with Bendai syndrome. As he tells her in an opening scene in this novel, you're the expert. And she says, I'm not an expert. I diagnosed him. I don't know anything about it. He wasn't even my patient. I didn't treat him. I just diagnosed it. I don't know anything at all. It's the first time I've ever seen it outside a book. It doesn't matter. Picard is interested, of course, in going to meet this archaeologist and curious to know what her findings are. The crew is a little bit disturbed at this change in the Enterprise's itinerary because they had a plan to enter into a poker sweepstakes. And that was the first disappointing note in this book, because that is all that Carmen Carter seems to know about this crew, and maybe at the point when the show was going on, when this book came out, maybe that was a large part of what there was to know. Fans have a fond memory of the final scene of this entire series where the captain finally joins the poker game that the crew has been having all along. It doesn't work, and it doesn't seem very convincing. Some of the characterizations that are done in this book of the crew are pretty good. Unfortunately, the characterization of Captain Picard is not. Starting with the very first scene where we're told in prose that is so earnest, I'm assuming it's not sarcasm, that even when he's asleep, he's imposing. That he looks stern, and the stern disciplinarian and the dignified captain, even when he's sound asleep on his pillow. I have news for you. If you think that's true, you need to set up a camera and watch yourself sleep. No one looks dignified when they're asleep. No one does. And that's silly. It's not even a mischaracterization. It's just a silly note to open the story with. If you're going to open with a note like that, what can you expect from the rest of the book? Now, I got more than I expected from this. It's a MacGuffin story, and those are inherently disappointing. And the MacGuffin starts to take control of Captain Picard. That's no spoiler. You can see it on the cover. It starts to control his thoughts once it's on board the Enterprise. And the crew starts to worry about that. And there are a whole bunch of other people that want this thing and that know that it was discovered. And that leads to a partial chase plot, a partial, creeping evil MacGuffin plot, and a fairly out of the blue but well done space battle at the end. I wasn't expecting any space battles to save me from this book, and I got one. And it's fairly well done. It's not long enough. But I'm afraid to say I have encountered my first disappointment of Book Trek 2022. This was, subsequently, once I was done reading it, I read about it. And it is apparently well regarded as a Next Generation novel. I don't see why. Apparently Next Generation fans tend to poll this rather highly of all the novels. Last year I read Next Generation novels that were much better, so I don't know what to expect here. I'm going to keep my Star Trek reading for August random. The only variation in that is that occasionally I will go back to an old friend. But I'm not, for instance, in this case, my natural impulse was to say, all right, well, maybe the signature disappointments of this novel came from the fact that the author sets it too early, or maybe the show was too early. That maybe I need to read later Next Generation novels, not earlier ones. I have no idea how early this one is, but it feels early. It's at least as early as that Sarek episode on the Next Generation. I'm not going to do that, though. I'm not going to intentionally chase down Next Generation novels that I think are playing to the strengths of the show. Because I shouldn't have to do that. And the original readers of these novels who were eagerly snapping them up didn't have a choice but to do that. So I'm going to take them as they come. I will spin at random tomorrow. This did not disappoint me quite so much that it needs to send me back to old friends. But I'll be going back to old friends all throughout the month of August. Because I'm not going to do it at all in September. So you'll have to bear with me. I don't think anyone's watching these videos anyway. But you'll have to bear with me. I'm not so discouraged by this book that I need a palate cleanser. So I'm going to do random again tonight. And if tonight's pick is also ends up being disappointing, I will go back running to an old friend and talk about that for half an hour. But anyway, that's my book trek for today. The Devil's Heart by Carmen Carter. Don't know this author. Hadn't read this book. Didn't read it when it came out. I remember I sold it when it came out, but I didn't read it. And it played right into some impatiences of mine when it comes to fiction of any kind. It's a MacGuffin novel. First of all, I don't particularly like those. I think they are a fundamental laziness on the part of an author. But also, I don't think it got a lot of the characters right. So the characters sometimes are forcefully written, but I don't know. You Next Generation fans who've read this book, if you really liked it, I'd love to hear about it. Maybe I was missing something really important, but I've read a lot of Next Generation now, and I don't think I was. So let me know if you've read this, especially if it's one of your favorite Next Generation novels. Good Lord, I'm not intending any criticism here. I'm not attacking that. It just wasn't a favorite of mine, that's for sure. So I'm gonna recover from this and go on to Book Trek 2022 next time with a different book. We'll see where it lands. Will it be a Next Generation novel again? No idea. I'll pick it at random tonight. I literally I just spin on the iPad screen and wait for it to stop. And that's what I think. So I'll do that tonight. And you will be the first to know what the results are. So I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.